the privilege of selecting texts and conducting a discussion of them for the Hike and Read program, I let myself be guided by a quote from the 19th century classicist and Epicurean by the name of Walter Pater, who is most remembered for the concluding paragraphs to his book called The Renaissance. And I paraphrase. He says, "We have an interval, and then our place knows us no more." Obviously, the interval that he's talking about is the cradle to the grave, from birth to death. That's what we all have. He says this: "Some spend this interval in listlessness, but the wisest spend it in art and song. Great passions may give us a quickened sense of life. Only be sure it is a passion that yields a quickened, multiplied consciousness." Now, this heightened, multiplied consciousness comes to us most clearly, Pater says, in the form of art. For art comes to us professing, frankly, to give nothing but the highest quality to your moments as they pass. Now, whatever this term multiplied consciousness means, its effect is to expand this interval, to get as many pulsations into it as possible. Now, that's a high standard, but certainly one worthy of incoming honor students at Montana State University. Now, to be a work of art, a book must be large, not necessarily in size, but in an aesthetic sense, whole, single, integrated, unified, but also large in theme. The themes of the 6 books previously chosen all satisfy these conditions. What is quality was one theme. How does the imagination intersect with reality is another. Where is the still point of the turning world? What is the responsibility of the individual in an unjust society? And what do you plan to do with your one and only beautiful and wild life? And just last year, we had this theme. How can you construct a temenos, a sacred precinct, in which everything you say, everything you see, and everything you do is raised to their highest pitch? So, aesthetically large and large in theme. All 6 books pass the test. In addition, the book as a work of art must also be many in the sense of containing multiple parts and levels, making it impossible to ever finish, for they provide new information, insights with every new reading. They suggest the features of what I call the everything book, or they create the illusion that they possess everything you need for the purpose of expanding your interval. So in a phrase, the books chosen for Hike and Read every year for the past 6 years are: 1, they must be large, and 2, they must contain multitudes. And so we come to book number 7, Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. The wisest among us, Pater says, spends our interval in art and song. He has said elsewhere, Ilse Marie, that all the arts aspire to the condition of music. I thought you would like that. Whitman, in this everything book, understands that being original means going back to the origins. It doesn't mean doing something that nobody's ever done. It means rather going back to the origins to be energized by the forces and powers of origins. And the song, the work becomes the author becomes a singer and the work becomes a song. And the song is about a person who is everything. Homer opens the Odyssey, for example, with these words: "Sing in me, muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending." And here's Walt Whitman. He opens his poem by saying, "I celebrate myself and sing myself." Now, in the absence of an effective collective mythology, Whitman has to replace the traditional hero of our ancient texts with himself. He then becomes the all-around man who is at once Walt Whitman, as he says, one of the roughs, an American, but who is simultaneously Walt Whitman, a cosmos. How can he be both? And isn't this presumptuous? Way beyond egotism and narcissism? Who does he think he is? Indeed, the large question here is the largest one of all, the largest theme of all the books we've dealt with. And it goes this way: who are you? That's the question the caterpillar asked Alice after she fell down the rabbit hole. Who are you? Indeed, who is he? And more, who are you? And how can you be original by going back and imitating models, ancient models? Isn't that a glaring contradiction? One of many in Song of Myself. Song of Myself is a large poem. I don't know how many of you tried to read it, but and I don't know how many of you counted this, but there are 1,362 lines in this poem. It's part of a larger work called Leaves of Grass. And if you can see my particular edition, this one contains more than 500 pages. So it is quite literally a huge poem. It is large. It contains multitudes. Now, it would be a disservice to the poem if we tried to attempt here tonight, in the time that we have, a reading of all of those 1,362 lines. So this is my proposal. To do justice to the poem, I propose we stay inside the poem and do a reading of only one line, number 1,326, in section 51. And the line reads this way: "I am large, I contain multitudes." We want to consider the line in its immediate context, having to do with the topic of contradiction. Then, since the poem exists in a vacuum, we're going to step outside of the poem to explore the line's influence on subsequent culture by considering three examples: a current song, a nonfiction science book, and by considering the poet Wallace Stevens' poem titled Tea at the Palace of Hoon. Then we're going to work backwards, looking at two significant works that I believe had great impact on Song of Myself: The Way Things Are by Lucretius, and the Hindu classic, the Bhagavad-Gita. Now, there are advantages of anchoring yourself to only a single line in a poem. One is it becomes imprinted on your head, on your imagination. So you immediately will memorize this line. Nobody listening to these words and reading this poem will not memorize these easily remembered words. I am large, I contain multitudes. So it serves a practical function. Sometime in the future, someone is going to come up to you and they will accuse you of contradicting yourself. Now, usually when somebody, most of you already have had that happen to you. Somebody comes up and said, "I believe you contradicted yourself." And your usual response, because it is mine, is, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to contradict myself. In the future, I will try to be more consistent. But now you have in your arsenal some words in your head that you will never be able to get rid of. And they go, did I contradict myself? Well, very well. I contradicted myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Now, you might want to try that line out in some other kinds of situations, but I also would like to warn you that it might not work in exactly the same way. I can imagine you going, say, on a date with a person you've never known before, and you have a usual awkward conversation, and this other person will look at you and say, tell me a little bit about yourself. And you say, I am large, and I contain multitudes. Now, I don't think it's going to work as well in this situation as the other one. Contradictions. Literally, the word means contra, against, and dict, to speak. To speak against. And a contradiction is speaking against yourself. Now, if what some of the responses I've gotten from some of the wonderful honor students who took the opportunity to send Ilse Marie your little essays and responses, if what I'm reading is true, we come to a very different understanding of contradiction than something that you need to get rid of. In fact, a contradiction is a necessary ingredient in the overcoming of dualistic habits of thinking that keep us from experiencing reality more fully, which is quite consistent with Walt Whitman and the whole group of transcendentalists who really would urge us to experience reality directly. Blake Klostermeyer said Whitman does not want to be confined to only one description of himself, as he identifies with multiple methods of expressing himself. Hallie Archer said contradiction is both a natural and a desirable quality of human nature. Our nature should not be restrained by convention or expectations. Rather, it should be allowed to challenge, question, and change. It should be allowed to alter our even perspectives that may seem to be contradictory. And Emily Tuck said, I can be whatever I want to be and still be a student, an athlete, and a daughter. Now, I'm going to make double use of Emily's response. A little later on, I'm going to bring it up in relation to the Wallace Stevens poem about tea at the Palace of Hoon. And Riley Ferry said, I contain multitudes explains why human beings feel a sense of wholeness when we let all other distractions go and simply be in whatever busyness constantly surrounds it. I love that word busyness. We're going to come back to that one too. To be in the midst of all this busyness without feeling the urge or the necessity to tie all of these things together. And Niels Bohr said, you can recognize a small truth because its opposite is falsehood. The opposite of a great truth is another great truth. Now, Whitman comes close to this in section 3 when he says, out of the dimness, opposite equals advance. Let me reread that. That's a hard one. Out of the dimness, opposite equals advance. I know when you read this, you probably just went right beyond it because it demands something of you. And by the way, I just tricked you when I mentioned Niels Bohr because he's not an incoming honor student. Ilse Marie knows that. He is a Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist from Denmark who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1922, working on themes of complementarity and the issues involving particles and waves. But I tricked you because I wanted you to think he was there in the conversation and you didn't think otherwise. And why shouldn't he be? Why shouldn't you be able to hear him as talking on the same level with the same insights as all of the other honor students who have come to this virtual I Can Read? So, how do we test Niels Bohr's thesis that the opposite of a great truth is another great truth? Well, let's take the one we're working on. I am large, I contain multitudes. What would be the opposite of that? The opposite would be I am small, I contain nothing. John Keats, the British poet, wrote about what he called negative capability. He said the capacity of being in uncertainty, doubts, and mysteries without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, a quality he thought was possessed supremely by William Shakespeare. And he explained in this letter to his brother, he said that Shakespeare was able to empty himself out, kenosis, and emptying. Why would he want to empty himself out? So that he could contain everything. He filled himself up with everything so that when you experience Shakespeare, you're not experiencing anything that this particular person, say, believed or didn't believe. What you were experiencing were all the creatures that he created and all of the things they said and believed. So he removed himself from the occasion. So we are really being untruthful when we say that Shakespeare said that, say, Polonius, when he's talking in Hamlet, says, I'm trying to remember the line, maybe somebody can help me out with it. Linda, can you help me? Be true to yourself.
Neither borrower nor lender be.
Neither a borrower nor, and this above all else, to thine own self be true, Ben Lubner. I forgot it for a moment, but here's somebody speaking a great truth. On the other hand, if you read Shakespeare correctly, you will know that these words were placed in the mouth of a character in a play, and the character is not true to himself. And so we've expanded our sense of what contradictions are. Do not say that Shakespeare said, and then put into Shakespeare's mouth something that one of his characters said. This is called negative capability. Shakespeare emptied himself out so that he could create room for everything. Song of Myself, section 51. Listen to this. Does this sound like, how do I get myself to be bigger, Sydney? Do I, maybe Davida can help me here. I'm very small. And
so in the top right-hand corner,
yes?
Click to the little circle that's closest to the left side. Either the left or the middle one.
Okay. And
that's going to be your best bet. So you're right now on grid view. You want to be on active speaker and thumbnail video view or active speaker video view.
Be larger. So what do I do?
So click on that middle one. So do you see in the top right corner, you see the 4 little dots, little squares?
Okay.
Now scoot your mouse over one, and you should see like a bar with little dots below it. Click on that one. You should see people now at the bottom of your screen, and you big in the center.
How about that one right there?
that you
Okay. All right. Well, it's not going to be a problem. Okay, let's go back to where we were. We're talking about negative capability. And I was going to quote where Whitman said something that sounds very much like John Keats at the very beginning of section 51. He says, "The past and the present wilt, I have filled them, emptied them, and proceed to fill my next fold of the future." Filling up, kenosis, chlorosis is filling up, kenosis is entering out. One more observation, and we'll jump out of the poem into questions of influence. We would be remiss if we didn't address the two greatest contradictions in the world of Walt Whitman. First, the one and the many, and then the exceptional and the ordinary. At one end of the one and many continuum are those who, quote, relate everything to a single universalizing, organizing principle, and at the other end, those who pursue many ends, often unrelated and even contradictory. Now, you may think of yourself as being one or the other. Those are not my words, but the words of a cultural critic named Isaiah Berlin in a very famous essay he called The Hedgehog and the Fox, named after a fable of the ancient Greek Archilochus, who observed that the hedgehog knows one big thing while the fox knows many little things. Berlin lined up thinkers and writers from the past and tried to categorize them as hedgehog, foxes, or something in between. He found that in the world of philosophy, Plato was clearly a hedgehog and Aristotle a fox. That in literature, particularly Russian literature, which was his exclusive domain, Dostoevsky was clearly a hedgehog, and Tolstoy was by nature a fox. Now, what Berlin found out was that even if Tolstoy was by temperament and disposition a fox, being able to live within this area of what Riley called busyness, uncertainties and doubts and mysteries and confusion, and the tumultuous manyness that he yearned to become a hedgehog to clear up all of that confusion. And I would guess that Berlin, though he doesn't discuss Whitman, would put him in that same category. Walt Whitman is by temperament and disposition a fox. He doesn't, not only does he not mind manyness and confusion and levels and categories and itemizations and catalogs, he loves them. Part of what he thinks he does in his poetry is to use these techniques to account for the manyness of the world. And anyone who's read Song of Myself knows what I'm talking about. He contains multitudes, but wonders how those diffuse and distinct elements might come together. Whitman was living out this contradiction in mid-19th century America as the United States was being tested as to how a lot of separate and distinct entities could nevertheless come together in a union. Add to this the contradiction involving the exceptional and the ordinary, and you get Whitman's and this country's agonizing dilemma. Whitman was clearly a champion of the common and the ordinary, and this shows forth on every page of Song of Myself. There are no hierarchies anywhere. No part of the body is more important than any other, and no person is less than any other, regardless of their beliefs, the color of their skin. We find the exceptional in the ordinary for Whitman. As a fellow mystic put it, we can find the world in a grain of sand. America, which Whitman considered itself a poem, is a radical experiment in seeing whether diversity and equality could not only survive, but prevail. Though the poem opens with a celebration of the I celebrate myself, leading people to accuse Whitman of being narcissistic and egotistic. As it moves along, it moves in the direction of the we and finally ends with the word you. Here are the last 3 lines of Song of Myself. Failing to fetch me, at first keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you. And that you is we the people, who are many and one, and that you is also the reader, for whom this good gray poet will have been good health. You, the reader, whose blood will be filtered and fibered by him, who, though dead, can still be found, both in a mound of common dirt from which grows the grass under your boot soles, or he can be found somewhere else waiting for you. Now we want to jump out of the poem. We've spent our time on a single line, and what amazing multitudes come out of a single line of Walt Whitman's poem. Now we go to the question of influence, not only the things that influenced Walt Whitman in his poem, but how Whitman and that line in particular influenced subsequent culture in all of its levels, high culture, middle culture, and low culture. So we're going to talk about song. Myself, the first thing we're going to look at is a song, the song from Bob Dylan, just coincidentally titled I Contain Multitudes, and a science book written by Ed Yong, also titled I Contain Multitudes, and a poet who is tremendously influenced by Walt Whitman, Wallace Stevens, who in one rather amazing experiment tried to take the entirety of all 1,362 lines of Song of Myself and compress it into 12 lines. And we'll share that kind of poetic miracle with you. First of all, Bob Dylan. I hope all of you have had an opportunity to go online and listen to his song, obviously in honor of Walt Whitman, called I Contain Multitude. It contains the line, a man of contradictions and many moods, I contain multitudes. I can't sing it like Bob Dylan, but I'm assuming you can nod your heads. How many of you heard them? If you nod your heads, I can see you. I see a few heads nodding there. Catherine, you've heard this song. He supplies us with a miscellany of names from all levels of culture, ranging from Anne Frank to Indiana Jones. And he even gives a call out to William Blake, who wrote that poem about a grain of sand, to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hands and eternity in an hour. He's channeling or creating a channel directly to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said that what we need to do in this life is to cultivate a maximum number of good hours. Now, Ed Yong takes issue with the notion that we all die alone. We don't die alone, says Yong. We have lots and lots of company. The microbes that inhabit the body, both inside and out, are called to a great feast when the atoms that compose your body depart. Whitman would be most interested in Jung's book, it seems, understanding that multitudes refer not only to the far-flung galaxies, but to the nonillion, I learned a new word, nonillion cells that exceed, microbial cells that exceed the number of stars in the observable universe. Nonillion, a 1 followed by 30 zeros. I contain multitudes, indeed. Now, Wallace Stevens wrote a poem called tea at the Palais of Hun. I won't even begin to try to explain that because I don't know. But I know the poem, and it goes this way. Not less because I descended the western day through what you called the loneliest air. Not less was I myself. What was the ointment sprinkled on my beard? What were the hymns that buzzed beside my ears? What was the sea whose tide swept through me there? Out of my mind the golden ointment rained. My ears made the blowing hymns they heard. I was myself the compass of that sea. And what I saw and heard and felt came not but from myself. And there I found myself more truly and more strange. Now I have to call out Emily again for having said, I can be whatever I want to be, still be a student, athlete, and daughter. I am large, I contain multitudes. Now here is a person in the Stevens poem who can be both himself and the sun setting at sunset, dressed in purple robes and setting in the west. How can a person be both himself and a sun? Inside his mind, he finds the powers to be one and yet someone other. Not only someone other else, but also someone extraordinarily other, such as the sun. We'll come back to that equation that Walt Whitman makes of himself with the sun a little bit later. So those are some ways of looking at how that line influenced the future. Now we go to the influences of the past on that line and the totality of Song of Myself. We would be here all night just to enumerate the number of influences on the poem. So I'm going to restrict myself to two big ones and a couple of small ones. First, a philosophical poem on science by a Roman named Lucretius, named The Way Things Are, and the other one of the most famous religious texts in the world, the Bhagavad-Gita. Now we know that Whitman was familiar with both. He owned a copy of the John Watson translation of Lucretius, which he outlined extensively, and we know that Emerson had written a letter to Whitman saying that he thought Leaves of Grass to be a combination of the Bhagavad-Gita and the New York Herald. Now, as always, Emerson got it right. Leaves of Grass was simultaneously a transcendent work of religious imagination and a mundane account of what Whitman calls the blab of the pave, the people on the pavement in the city blabbering all the time. Embodied in a local newspaper. The contradiction Emerson saw in Leaves of Grass between a sacred and profane, or between the imagination, the poet, and science can be seen when we look at these two remarkable texts. And another example of opposite equals, which reside in Whitman's enlarged self. Lucretius is a ruthless materialist insisting that reality is composed of only two things, atoms and the void. The void is merely the space in which atoms can do their complicated dance. A good materialist, Lucretius learned to carefully observe what he saw. And what he saw one day was dust motes dancing in a ray of sunlight. The motion of these motes, later to be called Brownian, became the basis for how Lucretius modified the theory of atoms handed down from Democritus to Epicurus, and then to Lucretius. Lucretius came up with an idea that the Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana called the greatest thought that mankind has ever hit upon. He said mankind back then. We would say humankind. And here it is, that great thought. All that we observe, including ourselves, may be merely the passing forms of a permanent substance. The substance consists of atoms, invisible and indestructible particles, which in the beginning fell like rain in perpendicular columns until one day one atom made an imperceptible swerve, a slight bounce, a declinatio, a Kleinemann, and set off a chain reaction resulting in bindings and blendings which became everything. Everything in the universe, and all without benefit of clergy. But while the atoms themselves are infinite and eternal, the things they make are perishable. All things die. Lovers and lamps, by the way, those two words come from Song of Myself. Lovers and lamps are equally composed of atoms. Ravens and writing desks, stars and cars, bodies and their souls are all aggregates of atoms here for an interval, and then their place knows them no more. All things are turned. One called Lucretius's work the great poem of death. The atoms dispersed by a dying artifact don't disappear. They go on to create other aggregates, so that it's not outrageous to claim that an atom that used to belong to a star is now occupying an aggregate known as an honors student. We may be the stuff of dreams that dreams are made of, as Shakespeare said, but we are also, as the sentimental scientist Carl Sagan has famously said, the stuff that stars are made of. Now, Lucretius gives thanks to his teacher Epicurus for removing the scales from his eyes, for wiping away all delusions so that he can see clearly and not be misled by religious superstitions and foolish notions of gods and insubstantial theories of an afterlife. Lucretius's poem disappeared for centuries and was rediscovered in a German monastery in 1417. Renaissance humanists embraced the book, and it went on to become immensely influential to poets and scientists alike. It was not well received by the orthodox of any institutional religion, but it was well received by an American poet who thought that though it seemed to regard our situation negatively, it gets it right about death and about how at some fundamental level we are all the same. And every atom that belongs to me as good belongs to you. Now, the Bhagavad-Gita appears as an interlude in the great Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. It is at heart somewhat like the poem of Lucretius, a conversation between a teacher and a student, a master and a disciple. For Lucretius, the master was another man, Epicurus, but by contrast, the teacher here in the Bhagavad-Gita is none other than God. The student is a warrior who has lost the will to fight and battle, and so he engages in an extended conversation with the god Krishna, who appears as Arjuna's charioteer. The Bhagavad-Gita is about what Arjuna learns from that conversation on the battlefield. Among other things, Arjuna learns the following: victory and defeat are the same, that one can never kill or be killed, that right action is essential, and that all action must be undertaken with detachment and without expectation of reward. Krishna teaches him a radical notion of equality. You must see with the same eye a heap of gold a mound of dirt, a sage, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and the man who eats the dog. At the most fundamental level, we are all the same. They spoke for a very long time on the battlefield. And then in chapter 11, Arjuna asked Krishna to reveal to him his divine form. I quote from George Thompson's translation, when the god Krishna performs a theophany, a showing forth of God himself, and says to Arjuna, look at the forms I take, hundreds of them and thousands of them, so many divine forms, so many colors and so many shapes. Look at them all and look at these wonders, Arjuna, so many never seen before. And then Samjaya, the poet and local commentator, takes up the narrative and he says, Krishna was a great wonder to see, with many mouths and many eyes. Divine were the robes that he wore. Divine were the perfumes and ointments. Ointments? What was the ointment sprinkled on my beard? So the poet continues, if the light of 1,000 suns were to suddenly arise, that would be like the radiance of this great soul. Arjuna then speaks, I now see that you are without beginning or middle or end, Krishna. The sun and the moon are your eyes, and your radiance burns up the world. Multitudes of gods enter you. Multitudes of singers and sayers chant to you. Arjuna sees the bodies of all the warriors disappearing into Krishna's mouth, and pieces of their flesh get caught in his teeth. And at that point, Arjuna asks the largest question of all to his teacher, God. He says, who are you? And Krishna replies, and I now switch to another translation more familiar to you, because I'm sure some of you in this virtual audience know what I'm going to say. The translation is by Swami Nikalananda, and it was spoken by Robert Oppenheimer in 1945 on the occasion of him witnessing the first atomic bomb blast. When that happened, he quoted from the Bhagavad-Gita in Krishna's reply, which goes this way: I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Even without you, Arjuna, I have slain all these warriors. At the end of the Gita, Krishna asks Arjuna, have you been listening to this presentation with your mind fully focused on it? Concentration, samadhi, focus, the unlocking of quality from our moments requires this from you, reader. Have you been paying attention? Krishna's last words are, Arjuna, has this delusion born of ignorance departed from you? And Arjuna says, it has departed. And by your grace, my memory has returned. My doubts are gone. My illusions are dissolved. I now see the way things are. And Lucretia, speaking of Epicurus in that book, says this. It's amazing. These two speeches are almost identical. He's speaking to his teacher Epicurus, for once your reason, your divining sense begins its proclamation, telling us the way things are, all the terrors of the world dissolve before me, and I see things happen all through the void of empty space. I feel a more than moral pleasure in all this, almost a shudder, since your power has given the revelation of all nature's ways. These testimonials, and I know my time is running short, from radically different cultures, one religious and poetic, the other materialistic and scientific, yet fundamentally the same, the stripping away of illusions and ignorance so that the student may be released from all the terrors of the world, turmoil, conflagrations, confusion, pandemics, sickness, political chicanery, old age, death, and to see, as it were, face to face, things as they really are. And to quote a Christian mystic who you can see above my head in the blue book on the bookshelf, Julian of Norwich, who said, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Last, a note on the Vedic sacrificial fires done over 3,000 years ago. I'm very close to the end here, Sydney. Roberto Colasso, in his book Ardor, says that those fires of the sacrificial rites were so hot that the officials could not approach them without being incinerated, unless they generated within themselves a heat, tapas, as powerful as the fires themselves. The self-generating of such heat is its own story, traceable from the Vedic fires to the amazing feats of heat by yogis, to the self-generated heat of Siberian shamans, not to mention our own shaman, Walt Whitman. So let me conclude by quoting from section 5 of Song of Myself. Dazzling and tremendous, how quick the sunrise would kill me if I not now and always send sunrise out of me. My last words are, this morning I found a new translation of the Bhagavad-Gita by a man named David Lindley. While all of the other hundreds of translations render the title Bhagavad-Gita as the Song of the Lord, this one is the first one to. Now, Sydney, questions, responses. How does this work?
Yes, students, do you have any questions, or anyone? If you do, you can unmute yourself or you can post them in the chat and I can read them if you post them in the chat. So, any questions at all for Dr. Sexson? We have plenty of time. And you can just go ahead and unmute yourself at any time. You can type them in the chat.
Did I render everyone speechless? Yes.
Probably. I can start off with a question. You've been doing hike and read now for a number of years. What has your favorite text been?
Oh,
tough question.
Like, who are your favorite children in your family? You know, you can't answer. If you asked me today, I would say, of course, Song of Myself, but because that's the one I read. I happen to be reading now. But they're all my favorite children, are they not? They are in such a rich conversation with one another that it's difficult to choose. Yes, of course, I would choose Walt Whitman because he's on my mind. But you remind me that we also, if you remember last year, Sydney, we were doing the Homeric hymns.
Yes, we were.
And Anonymous was a very prolific writer. And in the Homeric hymns were instructions for building a temenos, a sacred precept, where everything you said, everything you saw, and everything you did were ratcheted up to this extreme level. And if you remember last year, we had the honor students come forth and they did things and they said things and things were shown. And what were shown last year were their scars. Their bodily scars visible to us. They showed the scars to us, and then they told us their story. And frankly, of all the years that I've spent with Hike and Read, I don't think I have been in a situation that in which people were so rapt and paying attention so fully that it became clear to me now, as it wasn't then, that we were giving, without even knowing it, the highest possible quality to their moments as their moments passed. You were there.
I
You
was.
saw this. So I guess I would have to say the Homeric hymns that we talked about last year, even though that's a lie. I love the other children too.
We have a couple questions. Before I read a couple, you should all read the Homeric Hymns. Really great book. We have a question from Morgan Hill, and her question is: are there any texts from past Heiken reads that you feel would be particularly relevant or useful in our current situation today?
Oh, that's a very good question. Our current situation today, which I tried to encapsulate towards the end of my remarks by coming up with these questions of these words like turmoil, fusion, and political chicanery, and pandemics, and sickness, and uncertainty involved. What kind of books speak to this condition? And I don't mean to be cheating here, but I would have to say all of them do. All of the I can read books are such, what did I call them? Everything books. And I would love to do, a session with all of you on everything books that about everything. I truly believe that if we got in discussion of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, or the selected poems of Wallace Stevens, or the four quartets of T.S. Eliot. Right now I'm thinking through those quartets, and I'm thinking there's so many lines that address what we're talking about today. It was Eliot, after all, who channeled Julian of Norwich in the last lines of his poem, Little Gidding, when he said, "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crown knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one." And Eliot had been talking previously in all these poems about the situation that we're going through today, because this situation is not unprecedented. Every single generation, every single epoch of history will tell you that these are times of turmoil and uncertainty. Look at the literature of pandemics that we could, offer as an honors seminar. The literature of sickness. You could include things like Albert Camus' The Plague, or Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, even Pale Horse, Pale Rider by Catherine Ann Porter, which is all about the 1918 pandemic. I mean, there are many, many works that can address all of these things that are going on now. What I would need is for someone to maybe specify what of all the things that you're talking about that distress you, name one thing, and then my job would be to come up with not only books, but I could pick out of the I can read books, not only the books, but the very passages from those books, which seem to address that. So if anybody else wants to just throw out something at random, let me know. What is it that you think typifies our situation so fully that we need to find a text that we can get together collectively around that will help us, A, understand it, and perhaps even be consoled by it?
I have one. The feeling of being isolated from everyone else, even though, I can see all your faces, but I'm sitting alone in my house. And when I go to class, I can't see anyone's facial expressions or their lovely smiles or anything. So you feel isolated in your emotions and just isolated as a human being in general. So what texts are there that relate to that, or passages?
I have the exact right text, and it's the one we're reading now. The Songs of Myself. And why would I say that? Why would I say Walt Whitman? Well, first of all, because he really believes that fundamentally we are all the same. And he truly believes that all technologies share the same atoms with you. So Whitman was not a decrier of technologies. He was not upset about the horseless carriage. He was into all of these new technologies that people were criticizing. He was a great proponent of the locomotive. He was into photography. One of the very first persons we recorded on audio tape is Walt Whitman reading his poems. He celebrated technology. And so my answer to your question is that Walt Whitman would say, let's not be sad about the fact that we are only communicating with people virtually through these screens and through this technology, because these screens and the technology share the same atoms that are in you and me. I'm looking at you through my laptop, but Whitman was, and I was expecting this question, but I didn't get it, which is he was a great lover. Some of the passages in Leaves of Grass, in Song of Myself, are so explicit that it's really quite extraordinary that poetry like this could have been published in the middle of the 19th century. And I was expecting the question, was he heterosexual or homosexual? And my answer would be yes. He was omnisexual. He loved everyone and everything. He loved the word everything because the word everything carries that wonderful contradiction in it. Everything is both all things and every single specific discrete thing itself. And what he would say is that we are not separated from one another. I see you, you have a face, and you have a very nice face, and I see at the bottom of my screen all these different people in their various places cloistered to be true. But I always remember what another poet with the same initials, W.W., wrote. William wrote a poem called Nuns Fret Not Their Convents' Narrow Rooms. And he was saying, he was actually talking about the composition of sonnets, which are sort of small and cloistered and whatnot. But he says, within the sonnet, you can find the entire universe. And this strikes me with Whitman, too. What we are experimenting now with this virtual technology, which, by the way, is totally new to me. I've never done this before. As we do it and as we speak, I'm really trying to see how we can impose a kind of Whitmanian understanding of these technologies so we will make them a direct experience too. Related to this is the whole notion of reading. Often we misread Walt Whitman and we misread his good friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, with respect to the question of books. In chapter 2, in section 2, Whitman says pretty directly, you don't read books. The specters out of old books, they are an intermediary between you and the experience of reality. And so does Emerson. Emerson in Self-Reliance talks about books as an impediment to your experience of reality. Where's the contradiction? The contradiction is here. Both of these two people were voracious readers of books. So the question, they used this saying rhetorically. So the question becomes this, and I would love to ask Walt Whitman, because I know he's there outside. I think he's outside there waiting for me after we get done here. And I will ask him this question. Why were you so down on books? And I'm thinking he would answer by saying this. Well, I didn't want people to read books to think that what they read in the books was the truth, because the truth can only come from them. So I would ask him this question, well, is there a way in which books can actually be a direct experience of reality? And I really would wonder what you would say about what Walt Whitman would say about that. I'm thinking you would think very hard and very carefully about this and probably come up with the answer, well, yes, he spent his whole life inside books, and it's a matter of how you read them. Arjuna and Krishna, having their conversation at the end, seem to come to the conclusion that if you bring to a situation a quality of attention, a loving, what the Sanskrit word is, samadhi, concentration, then you will activate the kind of thing that both of these transcendentalists were calling direct experience. It's another way of saying, how can we justify using this distancing technology in a way that will minimize its distancing and promote its bringing us, as any have said, make any sense?
That's amazing.
If I can just sort of cut in real quick, I have another recommendation for you, Sydney. In literature that's about self-isolation and the difficulties involved therein and how it can lead to permanentness and all that sort of thing. Another good novel to read would be Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, the one about the guy who gets stranded on an island for 25 years. I'll actually be giving an Honors Presents talk on that one in a few weeks on the 8th, so maybe you'll check in for that.
Oh, I definitely will be there. And I'm currently reading the book in preparation for your presentation.
Oh, great.
I encourage all of you to read it as well. It's really good. We have a couple more questions for Dr. Sexson. From Caroline Rudner, have you seen the quote, "I am large, I contain multitudes," embodied in your own life, Dr. Sexson?
How long do we have?
Maybe just a few of the biggest ones.
These are huge questions. I am large, I contain multitudes. In my life, of course, just as in everybody's life, you have to deal with the question of the one in the many. Do you remember, is Emily part of our group here talking? I thought I saw her name at the front. Did she check out? I don't know. But Emily,
she's right there. Yep, there's.
Is she there?
She is, yes.
Third row on 2 screens, actually. Yes.
My screen, I'm sorry. I don't know whether this is a problem. Do I scroll here to get more people? There we go. Oh, yes, okay. Haley is there, Archer. I see, I talked about her. And
Emily's in the same screen. She's with Haley.
Is
Dr. Sexson.
Is Haley in the same screen? Ella, Eli. There's what?
2 people now.
Oh, there's 2 people. Is Haley Archer, who also was in the list of people. So, Emily, in your own life, there you are waving. In your own life, you said that you have experienced these situations to be all these different things, and then perhaps meeting some resistance from some people who said, because it is their job to say these things, you cannot be all of these things at once. That's a situation that almost everybody has gone through. And Emily has shared with us that she has to be a daughter, she has to be an athlete, she has to be a student, and she has to be several other things. And then, of course, she has to be, the son, too. As she's begun, to read Leaves of Grass, Walt Whitman turns out to be a person of such sensitivity that he even says in one place that just the touch of another human body would be unbearable to him. He is the opposite of what we call a sociopath. He's an empath. He has empathy with so many things that it's obviously going to create problems for him in his life. When he talks of runaway slaves or a suicide or a particularly nasty kind of situation, he can't help but not simply say to you, I feel your pain, but he actually enacts and relives the pain. It's all the way through Song of Myself. Yes, the whole question of one and many are involved in all of our lives, virtually on a daily basis in one way or another.
Our next question is from M. Daly. I'm sorry, I don't know what the M stands for. His or her question is, how can we relate to the idea of containing multitudes to Descartes and the idea of being only thinking beings?
That's a very good one. Yeah.
Our next two are very, very interesting questions.
Actually, I'm tempted to call my wife over, who really, now she's saying I'm not going to do that because she would love to answer that kind of question. I think, therefore, I am is, I believe Walt Whitman would say it would be a limited response to that ontological kind of question. Walt Whitman would say that thinking is one of the things that we do. If we are large and contain multitudes, we do a great deal more than thinking. And perhaps, as some poets have talked, a thought itself has a tremendous amount of power. A thought is the kind of knowledge itself. And so I would say that Descartes really circumscribes and limits the kind of abundant and exuberant and expansive sense of selves that Walt Whitman has. The next questions you say are really interesting.
The next question is from Zoe Freitz. How can we depend on our own truths if our minds are so prone to deception and persuasion?
Oh my, that in fact, that whole, the way that question is formulated comes right out of the Bhagavad-Gita. If we had more time, we would enrich you with the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna. And part of what Arjuna says to Krishna is that I don't know what to do. My mind is capricious. He says, I'm forever saying one thing and then contradicting it later. It's like trying to tame the wind. And then we have Krishna very compassionately trying to assuage Arjuna's grief at the mind's inability to grasp these very difficult truths that Krishna is saying to him. And so Krishna winds up saying things that seem to be on their surface preposterous, like giving this radical notion of equality, which was you have to see everything with an equal mind. And then he goes through a lot of examples, and frankly, he could have substituted anything else. He might have said, you need to see with an equal mind so as to calm the storm and the tempest of your emotions. You need to see a lamp and a pair of lovers and a dog and a cow and a sage and a person and a woman and a man and a television and a camera as being the same thing. Some of you are probably noting that I'm making a political statement here, rather unsubtly, but that's okay. So that's how I would respond to that.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Sexson? You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask, or you can post anything else in the chat. Anything at all? Yes, Dr. Lee.
I really don't have a question, but Dr. Sexson, as always, I'm just in awe of your wisdom and of your insight and your ability to connect all these literature across centuries from a lifetime of inquiry and a lifetime of study. And I just wanted to say how deeply grateful I am to you for this afternoon. And this afternoon, you made a point that I think is so important for the students, and perhaps you could elaborate on that, is that we often see our time right now as unprecedented, but it's not. This has happened before, and books and the collected wisdom across the ages is what can give us the strength to go forward. Perhaps you would just like to maybe elaborate on that. But again, just a big thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Thank you.
I had intended to actually address that question because it's very, very close to speaking about Walt Whitman. Most of the people that I am familiar with who speak of Whitman and the poem Song of Myself keep using the same critical words over and over again. And by critical, I don't mean negatively critical, but observations, and that is, he was unprecedented. This never happened before. The poem and the ways that he wrote poetry had no template for it. This is something absolutely new. It's never happened before. And I would have to say, I'm sorry, that's wrong. Because there is nothing that is without precedent. Everything we say, everything we do, everything we see has a past to it. Now, the past may be historical, or the past may be mythological, but there are people and situations that replicate rather astoundingly and precisely the very things that we think we're going through, and that sometimes we feel that nobody understands us because they haven't gone through what we've gone through. Well, it's a question of the imagination. The best example is Stephen Crane. There are many, many people who say that you cannot understand this experience unless you've been to war. And I bring in the best book about war that I have ever read is by Stephen Crane, called Red Badge of Courage. He was never in the war. And of course it sets up a real tension with people who says, you really have to be there. And I have to answer something to the effect, you need to enlarge your intervals. You need to enlarge your imagination. For when you enlarge your imagination and you create the kind of empathy that somebody like Walt Whitman has, you can not only imagine, but you can be there as Whitman has been there. As a poet, he does not like the simile, which says that one thing is like another. He prefers the metaphor, which says that one thing is another. And so it becomes a question of working with the imagination so that you can almost literally understand a situation even better than the person who experienced it had. Now you can see why this would create all sorts of wonderful conversations that can very likely can get very heated. But yeah, that would be my answer. It's a question of imagination, and if Walter Pater is right, and that what it is that allows us to enlarge that interval that we all have is a question of the arts. I'm sorry. It's the humanities, the things that don't simply exclusively deal with observation and exact measurements, that needs to be explored, even if it tends to get sloppy in places and imprecise and inaccurate because you have let your, say, emotions about things run away, and what you should have said doesn't get said. This, in effect, would be my answer. Let's have more humanities. And let's do something to redress the dreadful academic situation in which the humanities are disappearing across the academic landscape. Sorry about that. This is not a paid political announcement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sexson, and thank you to all of you for spending your Friday evening with us at Honors Presents. We had a great time. Usually one thing that happens at Hike and Read is you get a t-shirt. Because Hike and Read didn't happen this year, we have stickers in the Honors College office on the 3rd floor of Norm Abjornson Hall. So you're welcome to go pick those up. I've posted the credit link in the chat. So make sure you click on that link before you leave the Webex meeting, or else you will not receive credit. If you're worried about that link or not receiving credit, you have any other questions for Dr. Sexson, or you have any questions or comments about Honors Presents in general, you can email honorspresents@montana.edu. That's posted in the chat as well. So if there's no more questions, thank you so much for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to see your face.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Dr. Sexson. Thank you all. Thank you, Sydney. Great job organizing this. And I'm so glad the recording is going to be there for all of us who want to relive this. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawn.
Yep.
Thank you.
I'll leave this open for a minute just in case people didn't click on the link, but you're welcome to leave at any point. I'm curious, M.Daily? Oh, he just left. I was gonna say, what's the M stand for? Oh, sorry, say again. May, okay. Awesome. I was curious, I was like, it just has the M, and so I was like, I would like to know your first name. Well, have a wonderful rest of your evening. Do you have any questions or good? Awesome. You cannot find the link. That's because you're on your phone. So what is your last name, Barla? Spell it for me one more time. I'm having a lot of trouble hearing you. Would you send an email to honorspresents, capital H, capital P, @montana.edu? You have to have a lot of information, and then I will list you as attended, okay?
Okay, wait, can you hear me now?
I can hear you better now.
Okay. B-E-A-U.
E-A-U. Awesome. Thank you. I will put you as attended. Have a great rest of your evening.